Buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon. I am going to talk about water and energy, but before I begin, let me tell you what my bias is or my perspective, so you'll know where I'm coming from. I was in Mexico on 9/11. I was one of a handful of gringos at a binational water meeting. And the outpouring of support by Mexicans, many of which I didn't know, the condolences on behalf of the nation of Mexico to the United States was truly overwhelming. It changed me to be more empathetic, and I started thinking more about the commons and the future. And the fact that we're neighbors. We are so close, yet so far. And I think we should be glad that we are so close and so different, because it's that difference that allows us to manifest what economists call comparative advantage so closely and for mutual benefit. Whether we know it or not, whether we care or not, we all live in a watershed, and this is a watershed. This is the Tijuana River watershed. It begins in the mountains of San Diego and Tecate. The water flows 1/3 on the US side, 2/3 on the Mexico side. It ends up in the city of Tijuana, where it flows into this rich and biologically diverse estuary, and then finally into the ocean. But it's divided by not only a fence, but infrastructure. In some cases, triple infrastructure that bisects the hydrological and ecological processes, the species, the habitat, and everything that should happen in there. Water is also, I think, a great analogy for, or a metaphor for, the US-Mexico relationship. As long as it's in a bottle, for example, we could say it belongs to someone, and it's for a specific purpose. This is Rick's drinking water. But we could also imagine we could mix this water. And this is not something you do every day. Certainly you don't do it in a drought. But we can imagine making my drinking water part of the system, part of the hydrological system, part of the whole, part of the watershed. And we, San Diego and Tijuana, can imagine intermingling our other resources as well. Because as neighbors, our future is inextricably intertwined. Water is everything. It's our national security. It's green infrastructure. It's so simple. It's 3 simple atoms. It's so essential because all life on this planet depends upon it. And right now, it is so scarce. But San Diego's not having a drought, and Tijuana's not having a drought. The Californias, both of them, are not in a mild, a moderate, a severe, or an extreme drought. The entire West Coast from British Columbia down through Baja California Norte is in the 4th year of an extraordinary drought. And the climatologists tell us the good news: it may rain again. We may get an El Nino. But the bad news is, history tells us we can have a drought that can be 30 or 40 years long. And tree rings tell us can be 300 or 400 years long. I think greater than the drought of water is the fact that we may have a political drought as well. Or why else would Los Angeles and San Diego and Tijuana be sending 800 million gallons of this valuable resource out into the ocean every day? So I have 3 simple messages. One, that the drought of water is matched by droughts of energy and other things. Secondly, it's our scarcity, like our abundance, that links us because we are neighbors. We're in this together forever. And finally, that our history has told us we have cooperated in the past and we can cooperate in the future. If we think systemically, we cannot call this potable water or wastewater. We can't call it US water or Mexican water. We can't call it surface water or groundwater, fresh water from salt water. It's part of a system. And we need to think more systemically about ourselves and our future. We have cooperated in the past. When the United States and Mexico recognized how important water was to our mutual future, the fact that we have binational rivers and cross-boundary watersheds, they signed a treaty in 1944 on water. And the same commission that built these 258 monuments also built and administers the water system that we both depend upon today. When wastewater from Tijuana was threatening to pollute this estuary that is home to 40 endangered species, the United States and Mexico together designed and built and operate a joint international wastewater treatment plant and sewer outfall. When Mexicali had a devastating earthquake on Easter Day of 2010, we opened an emergency connection from the U.S. side because the earthen levees on the Mexican side had been destroyed and we weren't delivering water to farmers and to some of their residents. We still wheel water from the U.S. side to the Mexican side today. When California sought to restore the Salton Sea, they didn't do it unilaterally. They considered in their environmental impact statement consequences to and from Mexico. When we take from or pollute the aquifer, we notify each other with databases and models that we share with each other. But the greatest success of U.S. and Mexico in sharing common futures is the restoration of the lower part of the Colorado River, what we call the Delta, before the river dumps into the Gulf of California. We have dammed the river, we've diverted the water to agriculture, to cities for decades, and it's rare that the river ever reaches all the way to the Delta. So the United States and Mexico together found and stored and bought water, and together they released it in a pulse flow that restored parts of the river, and we scientists studied it. We looked at groundwater recharge and habitat restoration. But more important than what we scientists learned was the faces of little children who had never seen their river before, so they were splashing and playing in it. And also the restoration of people my age who had not seen their river in many, many years. Now, you may choose to believe that you're not a major player or participant in this system, but if you're like me and you eat water, if you eat food, if you drink water, you are. Because it takes an immense amount of this to make even the slightest amount of food. And there's tables out there you can read. You may not think that it takes much energy to grow your food, but consider fossil fuels are converted to fertilizers. Fossil fuels power the pumps that move this water. Fossil fuels drive the tractors that make the food and move the food to you. Knowing that 90% of our water here comes from the north, and 90% of our energy comes from the east, and 90% of our fresh produce comes from the south, from Mexico, thank goodness, you recognize you're part of the system. Are we connected energetically? Absolutely, we have to be for national security. That's one reason the grid goes north and south, that we share electrons. Depending upon the time of year, we have a shortage on one side that's matched by an abundance on the other side. Natural gas has flowed south and is now flowing north. It may flow south again at some point because of scarcities and needs. And just as recently as last month, the United States and Mexico agreed to sign an agreement to exchange petroleum, raw oil, because our refineries are used to the kind of oil they have, and their refineries are used to the kind of oil that we have. When Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, then President Calderon was flying from Mexico City to Japan by the Great Circle route. And he happened to pass over the state in the middle of the night when the state was on fire. And seeing the fire, he called up the governor. Even though the governor knew it, he said, "Arnold, your state is on fire. What can we do? What can Mexico do to help you?" Because we fought fires on the border before. That's what neighbors do. They help each other. They learn from each other. For decades, Tijuana has learned to do with much less water and still have a quality of life and a prosperous middle class. For decades, Tijuana has learned to do with much less energy and to have a future that's as bright as ours. Let me leave you with one last factoid. By my calculation, the number of international environmental agreements between 1800 and 1950 was a handful, or about one every decade. In the last decade alone, there have been over 600, or about one a week. This is because nations and cities and states recognize how important climate and energy and water and biodiversity and food are. And so they've signed these agreements for their future as neighbors. More and more, these environmental agreements are signed not by presidents and prime ministers, but by mayors and governors and legislators. There's a role for the two cities, recognizing we have this common future and that we're going to be neighbors forever. Before the drought gets worse, before energy scarcity gets worse, that we can cooperate with each other. Thank you for your time.